In this lesson, you will learn how to adjust your blacks, mids, and whites. So let's say that you had a shot that you wanted to make an adjustment on. You looked at it and said, this shot is too dark, or this shot is a little bit too bright. Or maybe you want to make an adjustment to make it look more similar to another shot, and you need to adjust the exposure. And I'm going to find a different shot here. I'm just going to double click on my example clips, and I'll set this to icon view, and I'll dock this right over here. Let's look at this circus mermaid clip. So I'm just going to drag this out on the timeline here. So this shot right here, I may want to bring things up a little bit because it doesn't look quite right to my eye here. So if I wanted to brighten up this circus mermaid person here, I'd want to adjust the exposure a little bit. Now, if I look at my scopes, I can see that this image has quite a bit of contrast in it. We have things that are very, very dark, possibly completely black, and there are some very, very bright points like these lights here, which are essentially fully white. So right up here in the Lumetri color panel, under basic correction, I have some very simple tone controls that I can use to adjust the exposure. The first one, that seems very obvious, is exposure. So I can just click and drag this, and this will expose my image up. Now, like I talked about in a previous lesson, there is in fact only so far you can go with adjusting the exposure and pushing values around until the image completely falls apart. Let's say, for example, I wanted to expose this up 2 full stops. Well, if you're looking at this kind of fit view here, you'd say, well, that doesn't look too bad. I'd say that looks pretty good. But if we jump into 100% and we look down here, you can see some of those compression artifacts rearing their ugly heads. And you're going to see that as you start pushing the values around, especially in the dark areas, like I mentioned before. Check out all of this black ceiling jazz happening up here. Look at all that blocky madness. That's not super attractive. So there are limits of what we can do here. Even though that looks like a better exposure, we are revealing some of those compression artifacts. And if that's what you need to do, that's what you need to do. And you may be able to look at denoising or doing some creative addition of noise to try and hide those compression artifacts. Or maybe in the scope of just playing this, they're not that bad. Now I can see down here that they actually are that bad. And that would drive me completely bonkers, this kind of jaggy artifact nonsense. But we don't have to expose the image up that far, and we don't have to push just the overall exposure up. We may be able to just push up the midtones. And we have some other controls here that we can look at to see what's going to make that happen. We can look at pushing up the shadows, and maybe that will find where we're looking for here. I'm guessing that this is kind of in the lower mid-tone range. I mean, obviously these pants aren't. Those are quite bright. But we may be able to do something like pushing up the exposure and then pulling down the shadows to pull down this area back to somewhere that kind of hides that nasty artifacting just a little bit. Now, I'm going to reset this and show you that there are some other controls in here. If I jump down to color wheel, I can take the midtones and I can push those up. I can also just take the shadows and push those back down. This is doing a very similar thing, and this may be a different way that gets the image to look the way you want it without perhaps revealing those nasty artifacts. Let me jump back here to this shot here. Let's say I just wanted to make a small exposure adjustment here. With the clip selected, I could just come over here and just push this up a little bit. And because I'm making a small adjustment, you're not going to see a huge difference here in the image. You're not going to start to see nasty compression artifacts. Now, this was shot with a different camera. This clip here was shot with a DSLR, and this clip here was shot with a Canon C100, which has a much better image to it, so it's going to give me a little bit more latitude in how far I can push this. But still, if I push this up 2 stops, you're going to see that there's a good amount of noise here in the image. But this is usually the first thing that you want to do, is make sure you get your exposure nailed down. Because if you do a lot of color manipulation and then you try and re-expose it, what you'll find is when you make that exposure adjustment, the colors may get way out of whack really quickly. So it's best to try and get your black point, basically where your shadows are at, your midpoints and your highlights kind of set before you move forward. So now that you have the basics of exposure adjustment, you're ready to move on to the next lesson. Coming up in the next lesson, you're going to learn how to adjust the white balance of your clips.